By the time the crate hit the ground, the men had already learned not to question it. They were unloading ammunition under the open sky, working fast, hands moving from habit more than thought. The air smelled of dust, oil, and sweat. Orders were shouted, metal clanged, boots scraped against stone. It looked like every other supply operation in a war that had blurred days together. Then something large stepped forward. It wasn't wearing a uniform, but it moved like it belonged. The bear rose onto its hind legs, wrapped its forearms around a wooden ammunition crate, and lifted it cleanly off the ground. The crate was heavy enough that two men usually carried it together. The bear didn't struggle. It adjusted its grip, balanced its weight, and walked forward calmly, as if this was just another part of the routine. No one screamed. No one ran. The soldiers simply made space for him. Someone laughed, someone else clapped, and the bear, massive, brown-furred, impossibly out of place, continued carrying ammunition toward the waiting trucks, blending into the rhythm of the unit as if he'd always been there. This was not a mascot. This was not a trick. And this wasn't a story told years later that grew larger with retelling. At the time, it was happening in full view of dozens of men who depended on discipline, predictability, and control to survive. Yet standing among them was a bear, calm, cooperative, and trusted. His name was Wojtek. And somehow, in the middle of a modern war defined by machinery and mass death, a wild animal had become part of the system. What makes this moment unsettling isn't just that a bear was handling military supplies. It's how normal it seemed to everyone present. No one questioned whether this was allowed. No one stopped the operation. The bear wasn't disrupting the war effort, he was contributing to it. That's when you realize something important had already happened long before this moment. This bear hadn't wandered into a battlefield by accident. He hadn't been trained for a publicity stunt, and he wasn't being forced. He was there because the men wanted him there. By the time outsiders first noticed Wojtek, he was already behaving like a soldier. He followed commands. He moved with the group. He slept near the men. He reacted to their moods. When they were relaxed, he was playful. When they were tense, he stayed close and alert. And perhaps most telling of all, when the men lined up to work, Wojtek joined them. No one had taught him how to carry ammunition. There were no manuals for that, no protocols, no training programs. He learned by watching, by mimicking, by existing alongside humans who were doing everything they could to maintain a sense of order in a world that had completely lost it. And the bear adapted. This is where most stories like this go wrong. They turn the animal into a symbol too quickly, a joke, a novelty, something light-hearted to distract from the ugliness of war. But that wasn't how the soldiers experienced it. To them, Wojtek wasn't funny. He was grounding. In a conflict that had stripped away normal life, family, and future, the bear became a reminder of something uncomplicated, something living that wasn't defined by borders or ideology. Something that responded to kindness and routine instead of orders and threats. And yet, even with that emotional role, Wojtek crossed a line that no one had expected. Because liking him wasn't enough. Feeding him wasn't enough. Protecting him wasn't enough. Soon, the unit faced a problem that would force them to make a decision no army had ever planned for. What do you do when a bear isn't just with the soldiers, but part of them? That decision would change Wojtek's life permanently, and it would lead to one of the strangest entries ever recorded in military history, complete with paperwork, regulations, and consequences no one could undo. But at this moment, Standing in the dust with a crate of ammunition in his arms, Wojtek wasn't a legend yet. He was just doing his job. And none of the men watching him realized that this single, quiet scene would one day force historians to ask an uncomfortable question. What actually makes someone a soldier? Because before the war ended, the answer would officially include a bear. Wojtek's story did not begin on a battlefield. It began far from uniforms, weapons, and ranks, during a retreat in a land already broken by war, where survival often depended on chance encounters and desperate decisions. In 1942, Polish soldiers were moving through the Middle East after being released from Soviet labor camps. They were exhausted, underfed, and displaced, carrying the psychological weight of imprisonment and the uncertainty of where or whether they would ever fight again. These men were no longer just soldiers. They were refugees in uniform. It was along one of these uncertain routes near a small village in Iran that the soldiers encountered a young boy holding something unusual in his arms, a bear cub. The cub was small, frightened, and clearly too young to survive on its own. Its mother had almost certainly been killed by hunters. The boy, desperate for money or food, offered to sell the cub. Most armies would have walked past. Supplies were scarce. Discipline was already fragile. There was no place for an animal. But war has a way of lowering barriers that once felt absolute. The soldiers pooled what little they had, some coins, a few supplies, and bought the cub. At the time, it wasn't a symbolic act. It wasn't a morale decision. It was instinctive, a reaction to vulnerability they recognized because it mirrored their own. They named him Wojtek, a diminutive of Wojciech, meaning joyful warrior. At first, Wojtek was helpless. He was fed condensed milk from a bottle made out of a cloth and an empty vodka bottle. He slept wherever the men slept. He cried at night. He followed them during the day. The soldiers took turns caring for him, not because it was efficient, but because it gave them something to care about. And that mattered more than anyone realized. As weeks passed, Wojtek grew. Slowly at first, then rapidly. His pores thickened. His curiosity expanded. He began exploring tents, chewing on boots, stealing rations, and wrestling with anyone foolish enough to encourage him. Instead of punishing him, the soldiers adapted. They reinforced equipment. They laughed. They learned his moods. When he was bored, he became destructive. When he was engaged, he was gentle. The bear wasn't being trained in the traditional sense, but he was being socialized. And that distinction would later make all the difference. Wojtek began mimicking behavior. He watched men eat and tried their food. He saw them drink and reached for their mugs. When soldiers smoked, he grabbed cigarettes, not to smoke them, but to chew and spit them out. When they wrestled for fun, he joined in, carefully pulling his strength when he sensed pain. This wasn't obedience, it was imitation, and imitation created belonging. As the unit moved from place to place, Wojtek moved with them. He marched short distances. He rode in trucks. He slept through gunfire without panic. The noise of engines, shouting, and machinery didn't frighten him. It became familiar. What started as an improvised act of compassion had quietly turned into something else. Wojtek wasn't being carried along anymore. He was keeping up. Other units began to notice. Soldiers from outside the company would stop and stare. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. Some warned that keeping a bear was reckless, dangerous, unprofessional. But the Polish soldiers pushed back. They pointed out something undeniable. Wojtek caused fewer problems than many of the men. He didn't panic under stress. He didn't desert. He didn't complain. And when tensions ran high, He somehow absorbed them, turning anxiety into laughter just by existing. Still, this arrangement was never meant to last. As Wojtek grew larger, logistics became more complicated. Food consumption increased. Transport became harder. And then came the issue no one could ignore anymore. The unit was preparing to move again, this time across borders, onto ships, into zones where rules were enforced strictly, places where animals weren't allowed, places where exceptions didn't exist. Suddenly, Wojtek wasn't just a beloved companion. He was a problem. Because abandoning him wasn't an option the men were willing to consider, and keeping him without permission wasn't an option the army would tolerate. That was when someone proposed an idea so absurd, so bureaucratically perfect, that it felt like a joke, until they realized it was the only solution left. If the bear couldn't travel as an animal, then he would have to travel as something else entirely. And in trying to save him, the soldiers were about to do something no military regulation had ever anticipated. Something that would turn Wojtek from a companion into an official part of the army, with paperwork to prove it. The change didn't happen all at once. There was no single order, no announcement, no moment where the soldiers collectively decided that Wojtek was no longer just an animal traveling with them. Instead, the shift was subtle, almost invisible at first, happening in the background of daily routines until one day it was impossible to deny. Wojtek had grown, not just larger, but more aware. By the time the unit settled into a more stable camp, the bear was no longer the small cub that needed bottles and constant supervision. He stood taller than many of the men when upright. His strength was unmistakable. And yet what surprised everyone most was not how powerful he was, but how controlled. He moved through camp without causing panic. He learned where he was allowed to be and where he wasn't. He recognized familiar faces and reacted differently to strangers. When unfamiliar officers approached, he stayed close to his men, watching carefully, but never aggressive. This wasn't instinct alone. It was social learning. Wojtek had spent every day surrounded by soldiers who lived by routine. Wake up, eat, work, wait, move. He absorbed that rhythm. When the men lined up for rations, he lined up too. When they rested, he rested. When they became alert, so did he. The bear wasn't being commanded. He was synchronizing. And that's when the line between pet and participant began to blur. At first, his help was accidental. A soldier struggling with a heavy crate would feel it suddenly lift from behind. Wojtek, curious and playful, would grab it and shuffle forward. Laughter followed. The task was easier. The moment passed. But it kept happening. Soon, the men noticed something important. Wojtek wasn't just lifting objects randomly. He carried things that looked like what the soldiers carried. Boxes, crates, bags. If it had handles, he grabbed them. If someone walked with purpose, he followed. He wasn't understanding war. He was understanding work. And work was the foundation of belonging. Instead of discouraging this behavior, the soldiers leaned into it, not out of exploitation, but practicality. They guided him. They let him walk short distances with supplies. They rewarded him with food and affection. They watched carefully for signs of stress or aggression. None came. Wojtek seemed happiest when he had something to do. The camp adjusted around him. Paths widened. Storage areas were reorganized. Men learned to read his moods the same way they read each other's. If Wojtek was restless, something was off. If he was calm, morale was stable. The bear had become a barometer. And in a war defined by uncertainty, anything that brought predictability was valued. There were still skeptics, officers who worried about discipline, soldiers from other units who joked that the Poles had gone mad. But the results were hard to argue with. Wojtek boosted morale. He reduced tension. He gave the men something uniquely theirs, a shared responsibility that transcended rank. And then came the moment that quietly sealed his transformation. The unit received orders to relocate again. Supplies needed to be moved quickly. There wasn't enough manpower. Time mattered. As the men began lifting ammunition crates, Wojtek stepped forward, unprompted, and lifted one himself. He carried it exactly the way the men did. Hug to the chest, steady steps, careful placement. No cheering, no applause, just acceptance. From that point on, no one pretended Wojtek was just along for the ride. He was contributing. But contribution brought consequences. Because now the bear wasn't just present. He was useful. And usefulness created visibility. Visibility attracted attention. And attention invited scrutiny from higher command. Questions began to circulate. Who authorized this? Who was responsible if something went wrong? What happens when regulations collide with reality? Wojtek had crossed an invisible boundary. He was no longer a morale symbol. He was part of operations, and that meant he could no longer exist in a legal gray area. The soldiers knew it too. They had created something rare and fragile, a living exception. And they understood, perhaps before anyone else did, that exceptions don't survive contact with bureaucracy unless they're transformed into something official. Soon, a decision would have to be made. Either Wojtek would be removed, or he would be recognized. And in choosing to protect him, the soldiers were about to take a step that would forever separate this story from every other strange wartime anecdote. Because the next thing they would do was put a bear on the books with a rank, a serial number, and a place in the army that could no longer be denied. The problem with rules is not that they exist, it's that they don't care about context. By the time the Polish unit prepared to move again, Wojtek had become too large, too visible, and too involved to ignore. Transport regulations were clear. Animals were not permitted on military ships. No exceptions. No explanations. Anything not listed on the manifest did not board, and Wojtek was not on the list. For the first time since they had found him as a cub, the soldiers faced a possibility they hadn't allowed themselves to imagine. If they followed the rules, the bear would be left behind, not transferred, not reassigned, simply abandoned in a place where he had no chance of surviving alone. Appeals were made, explanations offered, none of it mattered. To the system, Wojtek wasn't a symbol of morale or brotherhood. He was cargo. And unauthorized cargo didn't move. That's when someone, no one remembers exactly who, suggested an alternative, not a protest, not a loophole, a reclassification. If the problem was that Wojtek was an animal, then the solution was simple. He wouldn't be. The idea sounded absurd, even to the men who proposed it. But the more they examined it, the more it made sense in the cold logic of bureaucracy. Soldiers were allowed on transports. Soldiers had rations, soldiers had papers, soldiers had serial numbers. So they did what armies have always done when reality refuses to cooperate. They filled out forms. Wojtek was officially enlisted into the Polish army. He was given a rank, private. He received a service number. He was assigned to the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. His name appeared on official records alongside human soldiers. With ink and stamps, the bear became legitimate. No speeches were made, no ceremony held. It wasn't a joke, and it wasn't treated like one. This wasn't about humor. It was about survival. The paperwork allowed Wojtek to board ships, receive rations, and remain with the unit that had raised him. And once it was done, there was no going back. Wojtek was no longer just with the soldiers. He was one of them. What makes this moment remarkable isn't that the army allowed it. It's that once Wojtek was enlisted, everyone behaved as if it were perfectly normal. He was listed during roll calls. His food was accounted for. His presence was no longer debated. It was regulated. The system absorbed him. Other units heard the story and laughed until they saw the documents. Then the laughter stopped. You could argue with a rumor. You couldn't argue with a stamped military record. Still, the rank wasn't symbolic. Wojtek was expected to behave like a soldier, and in his own way, he did. He moved with the unit. He followed routines. He recognized commands tied to action, even if he didn't understand their meaning. And when supplies were moved, he continued to help carry them, now with full approval rather than quiet tolerance. There was even talk, half serious, half amused, about his promotion, though officially he remained a private. No one wanted to test how far the absurdity could go. But beneath the humor was something deeper. By enlisting Wojtek, the soldiers had made a statement. Whether they intended to or not, they had declared that belonging wasn't defined solely by biology or regulation, but by participation and trust. In a war that reduced individuals to numbers, they had added a number to a bear in order to protect him. And that protection came with consequences. Because once Wojtek was officially part of the army, he could no longer be shielded from the realities of war. He would travel where the unit traveled. He would be present where they were sent, including places where the fighting was real and imminent. Soon, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company would be deployed to one of the most brutal campaigns of the war, a place of steep terrain, relentless shelling, and staggering casualties. Wojtek would go with them, not as a mascot, not as a pet, but as a soldier whose name now appeared on the same rosters as men who would not all survive what came next. And that is when this story stopped being unusual and started becoming extraordinary. By the time the unit reached Italy, the novelty had worn off. There were no more jokes about paperwork or raised eyebrows at roll call. The men of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company had something far more pressing to think about: survival. The Italian campaign was brutal, slow, and unforgiving, and the place they were heading toward would become one of the bloodiest and most exhausting battles of the entire war. Monte Cassino, a fortress of stone and elevation, defended relentlessly, where every meter of ground was paid for in lives. The terrain was steep, muddy, and constantly under fire. Roads were unreliable. Vehicles broke down. Supplies had to be moved by hand under the threat of artillery and air attack. This was not a place for mascots. And yet Wojtek was there, not wandering, not frightened, not out of place. As shells echoed across the hills and explosions shook the ground, Wojtek reacted not with panic, but familiarity. He had grown up surrounded by chaos, engines, shouting, sudden noise, and the violence of Monte Cassino, while louder, did not break him. What stunned new arrivals wasn't just that a bear was present, it was that he worked. Ammunition had to be carried up steep slopes to artillery positions. The crates were heavy, too heavy for one man, and exhausting even for two. As the soldiers lifted and strained, Wojtek stepped forward, wrapped his arms around a crate, and carried it upright, exactly as he had seen the men do countless times before. He did this repeatedly, without prompting, without fear, without confusion. Observers later described the moment with disbelief. A bear, walking upright through a combat zone, transporting ammunition as shells burst nearby, not charging, not roaring, just moving steadily forward, focused on the task. The men trusted him, and that trust mattered more than any novelty. Wojtek did not understand the politics of the war or the consequences of defeat, but he understood routine, familiarity, and belonging. Carrying ammunition wasn't bravery in the human sense, it was participation. And participation in that environment saved lives. Morale shifted around him. When exhaustion set in, Wojtek's presence broke the psychological strain. Soldiers laughed when they shouldn't have been able to. Fear loosened its grip just enough for people to keep going. In a battle defined by attrition, that mattered. Even officers who had once been skeptical admitted it. Wojtek had become a symbol of resilience. Not officially, not ceremonially, but practically. He represented continuity in a campaign designed to break it. The unit later adopted an emblem showing a bear carrying an artillery shell, a quiet acknowledgement of what everyone already knew. But war does not pause for symbols. The fighting dragged on, casualties mounted, units rotated. Some men who had raised Wojtek from a cub did not survive the campaign. Others were wounded or reassigned. And Wojtek, unaware of loss in the human sense, still searched for familiar faces that never returned. Eventually, the battle ended. The monastery at Monte Cassino fell. The front moved forward. The war, grinding and indifferent, continued elsewhere. For Wojtek, the war had reached its peak and was already passing him by. Because battles end, units change, and when the fighting finally stopped, the soldiers would face a reality no amount of paperwork or loyalty could prevent. Wojtek had gone to war as a soldier, but there was no regulation for what happened to a bear when the war was over. And that final transition, quiet, unavoidable, and deeply human, would become the most difficult chapter of his story. Wars end loudly. Treaties are signed. Flags are raised. Units are disbanded or reassigned. Soldiers are told to go home, if they still have one. For the men of the Polish army, victory did not bring clarity. Poland itself had changed. Borders shifted. Political realities hardened. Many soldiers could not return without facing persecution or imprisonment. And Wojtek had nowhere to go. When the fighting ended, the army that had made room for a bear no longer had the authority or the resources to decide his future. Demobilization stripped away the structure that had defined his entire life. The routines that kept him calm. The men who raised him. The work that gave him purpose. For the first time since he was a cub, Wojtek was surplus. The decision was made quietly. Wojtek was transferred to the Edinburgh Zoo in Scotland. On paper, it was the safest and most humane option available. The zoo could feed him, protect him, keep him alive, but safety is not the same as belonging. When Wojtek arrived, he did not behave like other bears. He stood upright when people approached. He responded to Polish voices. When veterans visited, he recognized them immediately, standing tall, pawing the bars, making sounds the keepers had never heard him make for anyone else. He remembered. The soldiers, now scattered across countries they never intended to live in, came when they could. They threw him cigarettes, something he had picked up from camp life, even though he never smoked them. They spoke to him in the language of commands and jokes he had grown up with, and for brief moments, the bear who had marched and worked and belonged was back among his unit again. Then the visitors left. and Wojtek stayed behind the fence. He lived out the rest of his life there, well cared for, well known, occasionally written about, but never truly understood by people who hadn't been there. When Wojtek died in 1963, there was no military funeral, no roll call, no formal acknowledgement from the institutions that had once stamped his name into their records. What remained was memory. Stories told by men who had survived not because the war was kind, but because they had found ways to stay human inside it. Wojtek was one of those ways, a living contradiction in a system built on control and classification. He forces us to ask a question that still doesn't have a comfortable answer. What makes a soldier? Is it obedience? Is it paperwork? Is it sacrifice? Or is it simply standing with others, sharing risk, and carrying the weight when it needs to be carried? Wojtek never chose the war, but he chose the men. And in doing so, he became something no regulation ever predicted. If this story moved you, it's because it exposes something rare, proof that even in the most mechanical, destructive systems humans create, there is room for compassion, loyalty, and absurd beauty. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, share it, talk about it, and stay curious, because history is full of moments just as strange, just as human, waiting to be told.